Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterland, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Spooky season has begun. Welcome to all the horrors of Gen X nostalgia on this week's show. We're going to start it off with a look back at one of the most terrifying television shows of the 1970s, early 80s, In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy. We're going to go back in the day and look at the Treehouse of Horror episodes of the Simpsons television show. On the new Top 5, we'll look at the Top 5 1970s urban legends. And there will be a brand new This Week in History and time capsule looking at the 50th anniversary of the Thrilla in Manila fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. All of that kicks off spooky season here on episode 214 of the In My Footsteps podcast.
So what do you want to talk about this week? I have no idea what I was going for with that voice there. Part Vincent Price, part Undertaker from WWE. But we couldn't just kick off spooky season with a normal intro. Come on. I hope you like that. Maybe I'll do the same voice next week. Maybe I'll switch it up. But yes, this is the In My Footsteps podcast, episode 214, your home of the weekly dose of Gen X nostalgia. It's about time to crack open this episode of the podcast. Ooh, we cracked it open, all right. Energy drink, and at least it didn't spill. That has happened before. So thank you all for tuning in. It has been a really fun last week for me for the podcast. This week I had one day that was the best day ever in terms of downloads for the podcast ever. In fact, it beat my previous high for daily downloads by more than 3 times. It was so many downloads in one day that I actually looked at the numbers at first and was like, wait, that can't be right. There must be a glitch. I was waiting for it to get corrected. But no, it was real, and I was speechless, and I am so grateful for those of you that have been listening to the show, new people that have come aboard. Even to now, the majority of my listeners are from the New England area. But that being said, I've got way more throughout the United States and a growing presence across the globe. I checked the numbers. 12% of my listeners are not from the United States. So thank you for tuning in. Do I have what they consider a Cape Cod or Boston accent? I don't think I do. But when I lived in Las Vegas, people would ask me to say things in my accent. So I guess I just don't notice it. So this week has been the best week ever for the podcast, downloads-wise. This past weekend, I also was privileged to get to go to the wedding of the son of the Lady of the Dunes. I was one of a little over a dozen people that were at the ceremony. And when I was sitting there watching this wedding going on a beautiful sunny afternoon in Provincetown, it definitely was surreal. It dawned on me just how wild of a ride it has been for me when it comes to my connection to the Lady of the Dunes case. That I went from growing up with it on Cape Cod as a kid in the 80s to being in the audience or in the crowd, a small crowd, as the Lady of the Dunes' son gets married. It's mind-blowing. I'll have to check because her son, I don't want to name him yet, but I will say he wrote his own book about the Lady of the Dunes, his mother. I have a copy of it that he signed. I don't know if it's out yet, so I'm going to check into it. And if it's available to be purchased through Amazon or something, I will link to it in the podcast notes. Before we get into the meat of this podcast sandwich, I can't start without thanking my Patreon subscribers, Lori, Mary Lou, Ashley, Kevin, Marguerite, Neglectoid, Crystal, Matt, and Dr. Shrimp Porto Chico. Thank you for being my biggest supporters, my biggest backers. You too can become a Patreon subscriber and get a shout out on every podcast episode for $5 a month. You get access to bonus podcast episodes, access to the remastered Without a Map live streams. In fact, the newest bonus podcast went up on Patreon today when the podcast goes live. There's also an ever-growing free tier, including last week I put up the full-length Florida Living 20 Years Later podcast. I did the segment on the show back a few weeks ago, episode 212, and that was about 17 minutes long. The podcast on Patreon is more than 40 minutes, so you get all my stories. But enough with the housekeeping. Let's get into the spookiness. We start off the month of October with one of my favorite shows and one I was patiently waiting to talk about on the podcast. And this is the original version of the television show In Search Of, starring Leonard Nimoy.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Oh yeah, that's the creepy intro that has greeted me so many times throughout my life. In Search Of is kind of like the precursor to Unsolved Mysteries. It was a show that when it was on in its original run, I was a newborn to a few years old, so I discovered it a little later on. Interestingly, when I used to see the show, it was on the History Channel, and it had a different intro, more serious, whereas the one in the 70s show has that kind of odd music to it. But like I said, this is a segment that I have waited a long time to talk about on the podcast. It fits into the October spooky season theme, so I had to wait, but here it is. The original In Search Of television show premiered in 1977. It was part documentary, part speculative exploration, part mystery. It tapped into the public's fascination with the unknown. For me, myself, there are three things that I think of when I think of the show In Search Of. One is the fact that it was narrated by Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek fame. He's got a very distinct voice that would be laid over everything. Second is the subject matter, which, like I said, it was a lot of supernatural mysteries, disappearances. Third, and just as important, is the overall ambiance and atmosphere of the show. Very strange, haunting synthesizer music. The film quality, it wasn't low, but it definitely had that very 70s look. Slightly grainy, colors that were slightly more muted just based on the film. So when you mix all of those things together, it makes for a show that is very engrossing. Leonard Nimoy's voice talking about something like Bigfoot with strange music and the film that just looks like an old horror movie.
Is this creature really a relative of the Gigantopithecus, a primate that lived over 1 million years ago in China? The land lends itself to hide such a creature. There is food for it to survive. It does not need man.
So the idea for In Search Of began with a series of television specials produced in the early 1970s by Alan Landsberg Productions. Prior to the In Search Of show starting in 1977, there were three specials. The first was In Search of Ancient Astronauts, which was narrated by Twilight Zone's own Rod Serling. This was from 1973. Also in 1973 was In Search of Ancient Mysteries, which was narrated by Rod Serling. The third and final was The Outer Space Connection from 1975, which was also with Rod Serling. Needless to say, when In Search Of was being considered as a television show, Rod Serling was going to be the voiceover man. But his death in 1975 led the producers to seek a new narrator. And who better than Leonard Nimoy with this deep, commanding voice, the association with science fiction through Star Trek. The very first 30-minute episode of In Search Of debuted on April 17th, 1977, so a little over 6 months before I was born. It was entitled Other Voices, and it was not their strongest episode. It was studies that plants might respond to people's thoughts. Despite that less than stellar subject matter, Leonard Nimoy's voice gave the program a sense of gravitas, and there's always a market for that type of material. The original run of In Search Of was 144 episodes, and they had no shortage of topics to include on the show, but some of the most popular were paranormal phenomena like UFOs, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, ghosts, psychic powers. There were lots of episodes about ancient mysteries like the lost city of Atlantis, Stonehenge, the Mayan civilization, ancient astronauts. There were unsolved crimes like the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, Jack the Ripper, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. They had strange science and nature like climate change, killer bees, earthquakes, time travel. And then there were just things human curiosities like stigmata, cults, miracles, lost treasures. The thing with In Search Of was the tone was always speculative rather than authoritative. I mean, I played you that beginning clip where they immediately are like, this is one possibility, but not the only one. And the shows would also end with the same sort of way, with Leonard Nimoy saying something to the effect of, will we ever know the truth? Perhaps someday we will have all the answers, but until then it remains an unsolved mystery. There were a lot of classic episodes of In Search Of. For me, I remember the Bigfoot or abominable snowman ones being ones that particularly stood out to me as being very scary because they'd have noises like what the Bigfoot would make, or encounters people had with supposed Bigfoot. I think Leonard Nimoy was the essential part of the show, where you could talk about Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster and not have it sound like some wacko cuckoo with 5 followers on YouTube making a video. He and the people that made the show tried to maintain a quasi-scientific, thoughtful tone, so the more outlandish topics seemed at least feasible, and then when they covered real history, things like D.B. Cooper or the Kennedy assassination, the theories in there made more sense because of this credibility that Leonard Nimoy had. A fun fact about In Search Of that I didn't know until researching it for the podcast is that the original airing of the show from 1977 to 1982 aired in first-run syndication. This meant it wasn't tied to a single network, but was sold directly to local stations. This meant that where you saw In Search Of kind of depended on where you lived. At the time when In Search Of was out, it filled this cultural niche where the 70s, it was a decade of fascination with the supernatural, pseudoscience, alternative history. You had best-selling books like Chariots of the Gods, movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, public interest in UFO sightings that created fertile ground for the show. Some of my favorite episodes, I mentioned Bigfoot, I've mentioned the D.B. Cooper one, I'm just fascinated with that story.
During the waning hours of Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, a Boeing 727 leaves Portland bound for Seattle. This plane and its passengers will become the most infamous skyjacking in American history. A man called D.B. Cooper by the news media jumped from the plane over dense forest carrying 4 parachutes and $200,000. Why is the crime still unsolved?
I believe it was on In Search Of where I first heard about the Elephant Man, which younger listeners, if you don't know who the Elephant Man was, just Google it and I apologize. There were episodes about Amelia Earhart, the Titanic. There was the terrifying Nostradamus episode where there were predictions that are meant to have been coming true around now in the 2020s. I mean, no matter what age you are, you don't want to hear about that. Like, oh, in the future, here comes the end of the world. It's like, oh man, there I was, 12 years old, thinking about going to a school dance. I don't want to know about the end of the world when I'm in my 50s. So those were some of my favorite topics as far as In Search Of goes. So I was curious. I had to go to IMDb and look up In Search Of, and then scroll and see what the lowest rated episode was as far as the community goes on IMDb. So as far as IMDb goes, the lowest rated In Search Of episode is from season 2. It's about witch doctors, with the next lowest episode being also from season 2 in 1978 about reincarnation. When the show was on in syndication on the History Channel, anytime it was on, I would watch it. I didn't care what the episode was. I mean, granted, there would be some I was more excited about, but if I hadn't seen the particular episode, I would still watch it because you never know when you're gonna find out something you didn't know. One of my holy grails of research was finding a few episodes of In Search Of on YouTube that included the original commercials from when these shows were aired. I mean, what could be better for me? Watching an original version of the show from 1978-79, and then it goes to break and there's classic commercials in there. It's great. In Search Of ran until 1982, and it influenced later programs like Unsolved Mysteries, like I've mentioned, Ancient Aliens, Sightings, even The X-Files. It was partly due to the format of treating mysteries with a mix of skepticism and wonder. The show had a revival in 2002, hosted by Mitch Pileggi, who was on The X-Files, but I'll forever know him as serial killer Horace Pinker from the movie Shocker. It was then brought back again in 2018, hosted by Zachary Quinto, who coincidentally played Spock in the rebooted Star Trek films. For me, for this segment, it's hard to put into words describing just the whole vibe of In Search Of. That's why I've tried to put a few clips in there, which even they don't do justice because you can't see them. It's almost like you just need to go to YouTube, type in Search Of Leonard Nimoy, and pick one of the episodes out that has a topic that interests you. Even if you've never seen the show, you watch one, you'll get a good idea of what I'm describing here. In Search Of will always make me think back to my childhood, even though it came out way before my childhood. It's got that late 70s, early 80s vibe. It's a blend of documentary, speculation, and science fiction, all of it held together with that voice of Leonard Nimoy. And the show could walk the line between fact and fantasy, but it sparked the imagination of millions and laid the groundwork for those other shows I was talking about, like Unsolved Mysteries. So I highly recommend checking out at least one episode of In Search Of during this spooky season, or any time of year if you're listening to this after October. I do recommend Bigfoot or D.B. Cooper, but hey, that's just me. This week in history, we are going back 50 years to October 1st, 1975, and the historical third fight between Muhammad Ali and Smokin' Joe Frazier, known as the Thrilla in Manila. This is one of the most legendary fights in the history of boxing, one of the most brutal. The rivalry between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier had been brewing for years. It was fueled by personal animosity, starkly different personalities, and their shared status as dominant champions. Their first fight was in March 1971. It was dubbed the Fight of the Century, and it saw Joe Frazier hand Ali his first professional loss, winning by unanimous decision. Their rematch in January 1974 wasn't as dramatic. Ali claimed the victory by decision without knocking Frazier down, though. It was inevitable that there needed to be a rubber match, and in the time between their last fights, Muhammad Ali had regained the heavyweight title by defeating George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle fight, famous for Ali's rope-a-dope tactic. The Thrilla in Manila took place at the Araneta Coliseum in Manila in the Philippines before a crowd of more than 25,000 people. Television broadcasts brought the event to millions worldwide. The conditions were grueling. Temperatures inside the arena soared to more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity combined in drained both men even before the opening bell. I spent plenty of years working in restaurants where we would work in super hot, humid kitchens. I couldn't imagine then having to box with a world-class professional athlete in that heat. From the outset of the 15-round fight, Ali employed his sharp jab and quick combinations, taunting Frazier with his trademark charisma. Ali dominated the early rounds. Frazier began to close the distance in the middle rounds with relentless left hooks and body shots, wearing Ali down. This fight evolved into a war of attrition. Ali later admitted it was the closest he ever felt to dying in the ring. By the 10th round, Ali's body appeared drained, while Joe Frazier's face swelled grotesquely from repeated jabs. If you watch this fight and you see those later rounds, it's awful to see how swollen Joe Frazier's face is, right around his eyes and his forehead. Ali got this kind of little bit of a second wind in the 13th and 14th rounds, and Frazier kept coming forward even though he could barely see with his swollen eyes. As the bell rang for the 15th and final round, Frazier's trainer Eddie Futch made the difficult decision to stop the fight. He told Joe Frazier, "It's all over. No one will ever forget what you did here today." Ali later admitted that he was close to quitting the fight himself, saying basically that Frazier just quit before he was able to. The Thrilla in Manila is remembered not just as the conclusion of one of boxing's greatest rivalries, but also as one of the most grueling contests in sports history. I watched the fight again for this podcast segment, and when you take into account the heat and the humidity, and then you hear what the competitors themselves were feeling and thinking during the fight, it makes it a bit hard to watch. For Ali, the win cemented his legacy as the greatest, but he later confessed afterward that Joe Frazier was the greatest fighter of all time next to him. Which, if you're considered the second best ever next to Muhammad Ali, I mean, that's pretty good. This fight still resonates as the ultimate example of boxing at its rawest and most punishing, a testament to two warriors pushing each other beyond human limits in the sweltering Manila heat. And the Thrilla in Manila between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier took place 50 years ago this week in history. Oh, it's time to go the distance with a brand new time capsule. For this one, we're staying with the same date, October 1st, 1975. The Thrilla in Manila is going on. But what else is going on in the world of pop culture back then? Let's find out. The number one song was Fame by David Bowie. This is off of his album Young Americans. It features John Lennon singing backup. This song is sandwiched between two other releases from the album, Young Americans and Golden Years. I mean, that's a murderer's row of hit songs there. This song was David Bowie's first number one single in the United States, going to number one for 2 non-consecutive weeks. He would end up having one more number one song in the United States, and that was Let's Dance from 1983, which ironically is my first childhood memory of David Bowie. And it's the songs that he hated for years, but he said he did these more poppy ones because he needed money. And I just remember thinking, but those are my favorites and you hate them? Luckily, later in his life, he wasn't as averse to those songs, but for years I was sad that my favorite David Bowie songs were the ones he hated. The number one movie was Dog Day Afternoon, and you could get into the theater with the ticket costing $2.03. This is a biographical crime drama starring Al Pacino as inexperienced criminal Sonny Wurtzik. The movie made somewhere in the neighborhood of $56 million on a budget of just under $4 million, so it was a big hit. The film was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor, only winning 1 for Best Original Screenplay. The number one TV show was All in the Family. All in the Family being number one in the time capsule for almost every week of the 1970s is kind of par for the course. If you don't know this show, it is the sitcom by Norman Lear about the Bunker family living in New York City, Queens, New York. Archie Bunker, the ignorant bigot, Michael Stivic, known as Meathead, as his kind of antagonist. Archie's wife Edith, their daughter Gloria. There's a lot of taboo subjects that they covered on All in the Family during its original 9-season run. It also led to some successful spin-offs like The Jeffersons and Maude, and some very, very unsuccessful spin-offs like Gloria. And if you were around back then, October 1st, 1975, maybe you didn't want to watch the Thriller in Manila, so you went out to get some errands done. Well, you're in luck because there's a big sale going on at Bradley's. What are some of the fine things that you could get at Bradley's for the sale? Well, you could get Flair pens in 8 different colors, 3 for 99 cents. Gillette Track 2 razors for $1.29. Day Trill pain reliever for 89 cents. And some Final Net hairspray for $1.19. I'm sure with lots of nice aerosol that's great for the environment. So there you go. Some random things you could get on sale at Bradley's 50 years ago this week. So we're going to go from sales 50 years ago in the 70s to some of the weirdest and creepiest urban legends of the 1970s as we leave This Week in History behind and we jump into a brand new top 5. What better way to continue the first episode of October than a top 5 filled with urban legends of the 1970s? For those wondering, I have done segments on urban legends of the 1980s. That's back in episode 135. And urban legends of the 1990s, which was back in episode 167. This was really fun. The 70s urban legends, there were a lot that, boy, they brought back memories where these had kind of been established when I was a kid in the 1980s. Standard procedure with most of these top 5s is that there are some honorable mentions, and the top 5 list itself is in no particular order. Boy, do I got some great ones. Even the honorable mentions are great. So let's just jump into them. The honorable mentions I will kind of fly through quickly so that we can spend more time on the top 5. But that being said, honorable mentions for 1970s urban legends include Keith Richards getting a total blood transfusion. This was the legend that Keith Richards beat his heroin addiction by getting all of his blood replaced at a Swiss medical clinic. Another honorable mention was the Bubble Yum gum having spider eggs in it. This was because people thought the gum's softer texture was because there were spider eggs in it. Lifesavers, the gum's manufacturer, spent $100,000 on newspaper ads debunking this urban legend. Another honorable mention is that Mikey from Life cereal from the famous commercial died of a mixture of Pop Rocks and Coca-Cola. If you want more about this, I did a longer talking point about it in my 1980s urban legends, so you can go listen in the archives for that. Another honorable mention is that of Rudolph Fentz, the time traveler. This was originally a science fiction short story in the early 1950s, but gained greater notoriety in the 1970s. Purportedly about a man from the 1870s that somehow managed to end up in New York City in the 1950s. And the final honorable mention for 1970s urban legends is the legend of the temporary tattoos laced with LSD. This was supposedly Blue Star temporary tattoos, much like the Dallas Cowboys football logo, and they had supposedly been soaked in LSD and sold to children. So those are the honorable mentions for 1970s urban legends. How many of those are you familiar with? Obviously the Mikey from Life cereal, the spider eggs and bubble yum, the Keith Richards blood change, those ones I'm all familiar with. What's neat about the actual top 5 is knowing that the majority of my audience is around my age, a little older. I feel like all 5 of these you're going to immediately know. So prove me right, listeners. So the actual top 5 70s urban legends starts with number 1, the Bunny Man. This originated in Northern Virginia in 1970, where a couple was attacked by a man, presumably in a white bunny costume, near a railroad overpass in Fairfax County. There were more than 50 sightings of the Bunny Man in the time from when the first reports came in. The reports of the Bunny Man became a little bit like the game of telephone, where what started off as an actual event became distorted with additional details like dead rabbits, mental patients, and things like that became involved. So what's fascinating is this urban legend is based in reality, but then became more fantastical as people added details and embellished some things. As far as I can find in my research, there was never a suspect as far as the Bunny Man went. There was never a suit found, so it keeps it a mystery. Number 2 is the Vanishing Hitchhiker. This is one urban legend that, although it was big in the 70s, it can kind of be from almost any era as long as there was motorized vehicle traveling. The legend tends to stick to usually a woman being picked up, usually on a lonely road late at night. She typically wears clothing that is not from the era that the events are taking place. A driver will feel pity for this woman, stop, pick her up. She gets in the back seat. The driver will ask, "Where are you going?" The hitchhiker gives an address. And then before the driver can get to that address, the hitchhiker has vanished from the back seat. In many accounts, the driver still continues to that address and goes there saying that somebody had been picked up and wanted to be dropped there, and usually the residents say that that person has been dead and that they were usually involved in some kind of fatal accident around the spot where they were picked up. It became big in the 1970s with greater number of vehicles on highways. Have any of you out there ever picked up a hitchhiker that vanished in your back seat? And I'm not talking about if you're an Uber driver and someone bails before they've got to pay the fare. Although I guess since it's all digital now, they really couldn't get away with it. Man, that makes me sound old, like taxis and paying with cash. Number 3 is the Babysitter and the Caller. This one is very well known. There's a young girl babysitting some kids at a house. She gets a series of disturbing phone calls, usually a man. Sometimes he's just breathing into the phone or he's saying some sinister things. The woman calls the police and she asks them to trace the phone calls. And the big revelation comes when the police tell her that the phone calls are coming from within the house. This is one I remember very well as a child. Mainly because there was the movie When a Stranger Calls. It was from 1979 and starred Carol Kane. That's got the famous scene where the voice on the phone says the phone calls are coming from within the house. Funny thing about When a Stranger Calls, I was so scared of that movie and this urban legend that I didn't see that movie in its entirety until a couple of years ago. This is an urban legend that can be less or more disturbing depending on the version you hear, where there's some versions where it's the children calling, just trying to be little pranksters. Then there's other versions where the kids are murdered, the babysitter is murdered. So it's like, do you want the PG version of this urban legend or the R-rated version? Number 4 is razor blades and Halloween candy. Oh boy, did I hear about this a lot when I was trick-or-treating. Be careful if people give you fruit, because they may have jammed razor blades into it. When it came to people handing out fruit on Halloween, it was either, I think my mother got sick of cutting open apples. I think usually we just threw them away. But it's like, if you're going to go trick-or-treating and someone's going to give out apples or toothbrushes or religious paraphernalia. It's like, you might as well just leave your lights off on Halloween. Like, really? I'm gonna get dressed up as Freddy Krueger for you to give me a frickin' toothbrush? Now I don't feel sorry that I egged your house. No, I will not be sharing the address where I did that. These urban legends, it's not just razor blades. It's more of the idea of people handing out things on Halloween that have been tampered with so they could be drugged. Razor blades was the most common. Although ironically, there's never been any confirmed case of razor blades in candy ever. I think it was just parents doing that so that kids would be more careful on Halloween. Although it did get featured in Halloween 2, the real original one in 1981, where a little boy was having to be brought to the hospital because he had bitten into an apple and it had a razor blade in it. The first time I saw that, when I was probably 10, 11 years old, man, that scarred me when the kid opens his mouth with a razor blade in it. Yeesh. I'm surprised I didn't use that excuse to get out of eating fruit forever, that I worried there were razor blades in it. Oh well, I guess that's one of my regrets of childhood. And finally, number 5 on the list of top 5 1970s urban legends is the legend of Bloody Mary. This is another one that it wasn't started in the 70s, but it was really, really prevalent then, typically centered around slumber parties. You'd stand in a bathroom with the lights out in front of a mirror. You would stare into the mirror and chant Bloody Mary a certain number of times. It could be 3, it could be 50, I don't know. The legends describe Bloody Mary as literally a bloody face appearing in the mirror. This face you see could be screaming. It could leave physical marks on you, depending on the version of the story you hear. Possible origins of the Mary of Bloody Mary were Queen Mary I of England, who earned the nickname Bloody Mary for her executions of religious dissenters. Another one was a woman named Mary Worth, who was either a witch or a disfigured woman with malicious intent. The first thing I thought of was the Mary Worth comic strips that were things like my Nana would read that were around from the 30s to it's still going on today. She is not the Bloody Mary of the legend. Although that would be a fun crossover. Mary Worth versus Mary Worth, the Bloody Mary version. But there you go. Top 5 1970s urban legends. How many of these have you heard of? All of the top 5 I had heard of. Everything except the time traveler and the LSD tattoos, I was at least familiar with. We're going to go from some spooky urban legends to some of my favorite episodes of television ever, as we do a little bit of a deep dive into the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episodes. For more years than I can remember, one of my favorite things I look forward to during the Halloween season was the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episodes. This is the episode where there would be 3 different segments, all different spooky stories, typically with some kind of a connection to a famous movie or TV show. It was an even wackier break from the wackiness of The Simpsons. I learned more about the Twilight Zone TV show from the Treehouse of Horror episodes than from the Twilight Zone itself. The Simpsons TV show debuted on Fox when I was in 6th grade. The fact that next year is my 30th high school reunion will tell you just how long The Simpsons have been on TV. By the way, a quick little aside. If you enjoy The Simpsons, there is a new podcast called The Simpsons Declassified. It is hosted by Nancy Cartwright, the voice of Bart Simpson and others on The Simpsons. It's an excellent show already. I love it. The first episode of The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror series was October 25th, 1990 in Season 2. Why not in Season 1? Because the show debuted after Halloween, so that's why. Unlike typical Simpsons episodes, it featured 3 self-contained stories, each introduced by a framing sequence. The original episode in Season 2, it began with Bart and Lisa telling scary stories to each other in their backyard treehouse. This would set the template for the future anthology-style specials. From the beginning, the Treehouse of Horror episodes were different because you could have characters die or turn into monsters or experience impossible events without it affecting the show in the future. You know, like there's the famous Nightmare Cafeteria episode where it turns out that the teachers are eating all of the students. And the episode ends with Milhouse, Lisa, and Bart all falling into this giant blender. But then Bart wakes up because it's just a nightmare. But then it gets worse because they're hiding from the fog that turns you inside out.
You're back with your family now where there's nothing to be afraid of. Except that fog that turns people inside out.
Huh? Uh-oh, it's seeping in. Stupid cheap weather stripping.
If you haven't seen The Simpsons and you don't know what I'm talking about, it's every bit as crazy as you think. Where they end up getting turned inside out, and then they do this kind of Broadway dance musical, just with blood and intestines everywhere. I swear it's funny. Each Treehouse of Horror episode featured 3 distinct horror comedy stories, parodies of famous movies, TV shows, books, and legends. Like I said, tons of Twilight Zone. You'd get things like The Shining, later on Harry Potter and Stranger Things. Think about all of the pop culture that has come and gone during The Simpsons. Not to go back to the time capsule segment, but when the first Treehouse of Horror episode aired, the #1 song was Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice. So that tells you everything you need to know about how long this has been going on. These Treehouse of Horror episodes would have darker humor, it would have violence and blood. Now, they would start the shows off with someone from The Simpsons saying this episode was scary, kind of giving themselves an out, but also warning parents and kids that this is not the typical Simpsons episode.
Things like the following half hour. Nothing seems to bother my kids, but tonight's show, which I totally wash my hands of, is really scary. So if you have sensitive children, maybe you should tuck them into bed early tonight instead of writing us angry letters tomorrow.
You'd also have creative credits where the writers, directors, and voice actors would be credited under spooky, pun-filled pseudonyms, like Matt Groening would be Bat Groening, for example. In more than 30 years of doing Treehouse of Horror episodes, there are so many that are just the funniest things. I had thought about doing just a top 5 of these episodes, but I wanted to do a fuller segment just talking about the creation of the shows in general. I mentioned Nightmare Cafeteria from 1994. There's another one from the same episode, The Shinning, which is supposed to be The Shining, but Bart has that ability to communicate with Groundskeeper Willie telekinetically.
Here's Johnny! Don't! David Letterman!
Hi, David. I'm Grandpa.
Don't! I'm Mike Wallace, I'm Marley Schaefer, and I'm Ed Bradley. All this and Andy Rooney tonight on 60 Minutes!
It's also in this episode, the fuller episode in 94, where Groundskeeper Willie gets killed with an axe in all 3 episodes. Which, again, I swear it's funny. There's the episode The Devil and Homer Simpson in 1993, where he sells his soul for a donut, and the devil is Ned Flanders. And Homer eats almost all of the donut, because he figures if he doesn't finish the donut, then the devil can't get his soul. And there's a whole big trial, but then at the end, Flanders, the devil, makes Homer's head into a donut, and he's finishing it off by eating his own head. I mean, I've got the list of all of the segments from Treehouse of Horror, and I'm just looking at them, and there's none, at least in the first dozen or 2 dozen seasons, where I'm like, oh, I don't like that one. Season 4 had the talking Krusty doll that tries to kill Homer, but then the repairman comes and somebody switch this doll to evil. They flip him to good, and Homer turns him into his slave. There was Season 5's Terror at 5.5 Feet, which is a takeoff of the famed Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner with the gremlin on the wing of the plane. I'm thinking if I had to pick a favorite episode in general, it would probably be episode 5 from season 6. That's the one that has Nightmare Cafeteria, The Shinning, and then the third one called Time and Punishment is when Homer turns his toaster into a time machine and he just goes back and screws up time all over. There's one time that he's super rich and his sisters-in-law, Patty and Selma, are dead. And he sits down and wants a donut, but the family doesn't know what they are. And so he runs away to go back in time again. And once he's gone, you see that it rains donuts. So it was like his perfect life that he left behind. To me, The Simpsons is one of the best shows ever. The problem is that it's been on for close to 40 seasons. And I'm going to be honest, I think the show should have ended with The Simpsons movie. And that came out in 2007. Despite the fact that I feel like the last 10 years of The Simpsons has not been good, I can almost always still count on the Treehouse of Horror episodes being good. Because they're always non-canon. It doesn't affect the regular show. Because after, 800 episodes where the time doesn't ever change and Bart has been 10 years old for almost 40 years, you really run out of plot ideas. Not to get too far off track, but for me, when The Simpsons finally jumped the shark was when they had a look back to the past episode where Homer had his own grunge band in the early 1990s. Because it's like, wait a minute, the show was going on then. That episode was from season 19, in case you were wondering when I think The Simpsons were last really good. There were certain things that you could count on when it came to the Treehouse of Horror episodes, including the appearances of Kang and Kodos, the aliens. They're typically always there. They're not necessarily in a certain story. They may be watching things from afar. Although there was one episode, season 8, where Kang and Kodos took over the bodies of Bill Clinton and Bob Dole when they were running for president. And since it was a two-party system, you had to vote for one of the aliens. It was basically, no matter who won, all the humans ended up enslaved by the aliens. Typically, at least one of the stories in each episode would have Bart and Lisa placed in parody roles of classic horror protagonists. The two I think of with Bart right away is when he became half fly, half human. But then there was also the fly that had Bart's body, so it was like a Bart-sized fly. And the other one was when Bart was the little boy that could read people's thoughts. That was from season 3. And it was a takeoff of the Twilight Zone episode, It's a Good Life, where the little boy, played by Billy Mumy, can read people's thoughts, and he would turn them into stuff. He turned one guy into a jack-in-the-box. As far as doing my research, I believe it's 8 or 9 segments through the Treehouse of Horror episodes are based on Twilight Zone episodes. For me, as someone that grew up with the original Simpsons in the 90s, I'm always going to see that era of episodes as the best. I would also say most of the 2000s episodes are excellent. After that, it's kind of a crapshoot. The regular episodes of the season might be hit or miss. The Treehouse of Horror ones are usually always good. For as many iconic moments as The Simpsons has given to pop culture in its 35 plus years, so many of them come from the Treehouse of Horror episodes. Only through these episodes could you get Homer Simpson in a 3D environment where he gets sucked into another dimension behind the bookcase trying to avoid having dinner with his family. Or you could get a takeoff of It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown, Homer as King Kong. Many of these segments are so iconic that you get newer generations, younger generations that learn about these horror films and books and tropes through The Simpsons before the films themselves. Like I said, in the early 90s, I learned more about the Twilight Zone through The Simpsons than the show itself. There's dozens of classic segments from the Treehouse of Horror set of shows. I could just sit here and keep naming them, but that would start to get pretty repetitive. Maybe it already is. But it is one of my favorite traditions in the month of October. Even if I don't really watch the new Simpsons episodes, I will definitely go back and cycle through some of my favorite Treehouse of Horror segments. because it's more than just a Halloween gimmick. It's now an institution. The Treehouse of Horror, it blends satire, horror, absurd humor, and they're a yearly reminder of the show's creativity. No other scripted show has lasted as long as The Simpsons has. Even though I may not be watching still, it keeps getting renewed so the audience is there. And in case you're wondering, there is a new Treehouse of Horror episode coming this month, October 19th. It will be Season 37, Episode 3, Treehouse of Horror, number 36. So I watched the first Treehouse of Horror episode when I was a few weeks before turning 13. And now I can watch another new Treehouse of Horror episode a few weeks before turning 48. Oh, God. That's the scariest horror of this spooky season. I'll end the segment with Grandpa Simpson sharing how I feel about growing old.
I used to get by on my looks. Now they're gone, withered away like an old piece of fruit.
Are you done?
But until next week, that's going to wrap up episode 214 of the In My Footsteps podcast. The first one of October, the first one of spooky season. Because of the way the days fall on the calendar this year, there's 5 episodes in October, so overloaded with spooky. I'll have to have some other guest introduction next week for the show. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed your weekly dose of Gen X nostalgia. I've got a lot going on. I mentioned a little bit of it at the beginning of the show. Yesterday, from when this podcast goes live, my 10th book was published. It's called In Their Footsteps, The Interesting People, Places, and Events of Cape Cod History, kind of going back to my roots. It's a Cape Cod history anthology. You've heard me mention it on the podcast a bunch throughout this year. And there were times that it felt like it wasn't going to get done. Oh, but no, it's done now. The link is in the podcast notes to the landing page I created. I published this on my own. I know I could have gotten a book deal for this. The problem is, everything is done with the book, obviously. With a book deal, there's a scheduling bit to it. So I wouldn't be able to say, yeah, I want this book published now. They would say, no, it'll come out in 2 years, maybe 18 months. So I was like, why wait that long when it's all done? This book has 40 stories, 40 chapters. They go in chronological order, beginning with Bartholomew Gosnold naming Cape Cod in 1602, coming all the way up to the Great Storm of 1984, the one that destroyed Great Point Lighthouse on Nantucket, and the one that washed the freighter Eldia on shore at Nauset Beach. So if you enjoy Cape Cod or history or Cape Cod history, unusual stories, entertainment, true crime, inventions, it's all in there. And if people are interested, if people like In Their Footsteps, it could be a volume 1. Because in reality, I've got enough Cape Cod history stories that I could make 2 more volumes of this book. But that's for the future. I've got enough on my plate as it is. Another thing on my plate is the fundraiser for the When Henry Met Henry short film. The fundraiser goes for another couple of weeks. We're going to film in probably 3 weeks from now when I'm recording the podcast. I'm so thankful and grateful to everyone that has donated to this fundraiser. The link to it is in the podcast notes. But if you're listening to this podcast after, say, Halloween, don't go to it because I'm going to yank it down once the deadline is passed. I've also been working a little bit as a, location scout for another film that is going on Cape Cod coming up the end of October. It's the same film crew that did the Cape Cod Cthulhu film that I have a role in. We filmed it in March. The movie is actually coming out the end of this month. You can buy it on DVD now. I'm kind of waiting for it to get up on streaming before I share the interview I did with cast and crew, because I want to be able to link to the movie so you can go and watch it. My hope for the film that is being done on Cape Cod this month that I'm doing, location work for, I'm hoping to get a little bit of face-to-face time with the director because I have an idea for an actual film based on a short story of mine. So that might be a project that we collaborate on next year. I have so much going on. I feel at times like I am running a treadmill, but also trying to keep a bunch of spinning plates going on top of the poles. But it's all good. It's all fun stuff, art, creativity that I really, really love and have wanted to do since I was a kid. Which makes weeks like this, where I have my best day and week ever for the podcast by a lot, it makes me feel so good, like I've got people out there that are finding my work to be destination listening, viewing, watching, reading. It keeps me motivated and keeps me going. Next week is going to be episode 215. We're going to take a bit of a diversion from spooky season, as I'm going to do 2001, the year in pop culture. This is going to coincide with the birthday of my second niece, Emma. So next week will be all things 2001 as a birthday gift to Emma. Music, movies, television, weird and funny news stories. It'll still be spooky because it sure as hell is scary at the fact that 2001 was 24 years ago. Jeez, I still think the 90s were 20 years ago, and that's not accurate. Happy birthday in a few days from when this show goes live to my friend Adam. A good man, one half of one of my favorite tag team couples in the world, along with his wife Crystal. I know how hard you work. I hope you get to actually relax and enjoy a bit of your birthday. I'm sure I will be seeing you around since anytime I go to your work, I kind of seek you out to try to find you and bother you for a few minutes. Regale you with tales of foolishness from my daily life. So happy birthday to Adam this week. Next week will be a birthday celebration of my niece Emma. And every week is a celebration of all of you listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. But until we meet again, remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path and enjoy every moment you can on this journey we call life, because you never know what tomorrow brings. This has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlin. You already knew that. And I'll talk to you all again soon.